The radar screen painted nothing but empty sky, yet Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel Phantom Thorne knew better than to trust the silence. Her F-16C Viper cut through the Nevada desert air at 28,000 feet, the afterburner's blue flame invisible against the crystalline morning. Something was wrong. The training exercise had called for simulated enemy contact at 900 hours, 15 minutes ago. But her RWR remained silent, no threat warnings, no radio chatter from Nellie's control. "Control, Phantom 1 requesting sitrep on Red Force," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. Static answered her, the kind of static that meant someone was listening but choosing not to respond. Her gloved fingers tightened on the stick as she banked left, scanning the endless blue above and the tan wasteland below. 23 years of flying had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct screamed danger. The afterburner flicker caught her peripheral vision, a brief shimmer of heat distortion at her 4 o'clock, maybe 8 miles out. Too far to be visible to the naked eye, yet there it was, a ghost of movement that shouldn't exist. Her heart rate spiked as training took over. Phantom rolled inverted, pulling negative GS to get a better angle on the contact, but the sky remained empty. Whatever had been there was gone, or had never been there at all. "Phantom 1, you are being monitored," came a voice she didn't recognize, low, professional, with the kind of calm that preceded lightning strikes. Not Nellie's control, not anyone from the exercise roster. The transmission cut off before she could respond, leaving her alone with the sound of her own breathing and the Pratt & Whitney's steady roar. She checked her fuel, plenty for another hour of flight time, and her weapons systems. Everything showed green, but something fundamental had shifted in the air around her. The exercise parameters had called for basic air-to-air combat training against F-15 Eagles from the 65th Aggressor Squadron. Simple, routine, nothing she hadn't done 1,000 times before. But this felt different. This felt real. Banking harder to the right, Phantom began a defensive spiral, gaining altitude while keeping her eyes locked on the empty sky where that flicker had appeared. Her RWR finally chirped, a brief ping of X-band radar, gone before the system could classify it. Too advanced for the Eagles she was supposed to be fighting. Too quiet for anything she'd encountered before. The radio crackled again. "Welcome to the real war, Phantom." Major Derek Raptor Kane adjusted his grip on the F-22's controls, watching the lone F-16 spiral below him like a confused moth. The woman had good instincts, better than the file had suggested, but instincts wouldn't save her from what was coming. His Raptor hung motionless in the thin air at 45,000 feet, invisible to her radar, invisible to her eyes, a predator made of titanium and mathematics. "She spotted something," came Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reaper Cross's voice through the encrypted channel. His F-22 maintained position 3 miles to Kane's left, equally invisible, equally patient. That defensive maneuver wasn't random. Kane studied the tactical display. The target, Colsane Phantom, had been handpicked for this demonstration. Combat veteran, 2-tour in Afghanistan, decorated for valor under fire. The Pentagon brass wanted to see how their newest stealth fighters performed against experienced opposition, and Colonel Thorne represented the best the conventional Air Force had to offer. What they hadn't expected was for her to sense them before visual contact. "Stealth isn't perfect," Kane muttered, remembering his instructor's words from Raptor School. "It just changes the rules of the game." Below them, Phantom had leveled off at 30,000 feet, her F-16 prowling through lazy esterns while she scanned for threats. Her radio discipline had broken down. She'd been transmitting on guard frequency for the past 5 minutes, trying to raise anyone who would respond. The desperation in her voice was subtle but real. She knew she was being hunted. "Permission to engage?" Reaper asked, his tone betraying nothing of the excitement Kane knew he felt. This was their first live test against a skilled opponent, their chance to prove the Raptors' dominance wasn't just marketing fiction. "Negative, we observe and learn." The The colonel doesn't know it yet, but she's teaching us something important. Kane watched Phantom execute another defensive turn, this one tighter, more aggressive. She's adapting faster than predicted. The morning sun caught the F-16's canopy as she rolled inverted again, and for a moment Kane could see her helmet, her shoulders, the human element inside the machine. He'd studied her file extensively. Daughter of a Vietnam-era pilot, graduate of the Air Force Academy with honors, test pilot school, combat decorations. But files didn't capture the intuition that had her dancing through the sky like she could feel his presence. "Raptor lead, we've got company," came Captain Lisa Ghost, Morrison's voice from the eastern vector. Her F-22 appeared on Kane's display, approaching from the opposite direction with Captain James, Shadow, Tor's flying wing. The demonstration was expanding beyond the original parameters. Kane smiled inside his helmet. For F-22s against one F-16. It should have been a slaughter, but something in Phantom's flight pattern suggested she wouldn't go down easy. Phantom's fuel gauge showed 3/4 full when the sky exploded into electronic chaos. Her RWR lit up like a Christmas tree, multiple X-band contacts, all around her, closing fast. The synthetic voice of the threat warning system began its mechanical chant. "Threat, threat, bearing 090, threat, threat, bearing 270. She yanked the stick hard left, pulling 6 GS in a desperate brake turn while her thumb found the chaff and flare dispensers. "What the hell?" she gasped, fighting against the G-forces that threatened to gray out her vision. The contacts vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving her alone in empty sky once more. But now she knew the truth. This wasn't a training exercise. This was something else entirely. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency across the cockpit controls, configuring her F-16 for combat. Master arms switched to ON, radar to air-to-air mode, AIM-120 AMRAAM selected and ready. If someone wanted to play games in the dark, she'd give them a war they wouldn't forget. "Unknown aircraft, this is Phantom 1 on guard frequency. Identify yourselves immediately or I will consider you hostile." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned command under fire, in the skis over Kandahar where hesitation meant death. The response came from everywhere and nowhere. "You're outgunned, outmatched, and out of your depth, Colonel, but you're not out of the fight yet." Phantom recognized something in that voice, respect mixed with challenge. Whoever was hunting her understood the game they were playing. She rolled inverted and pulled into a steep dive, trading altitude for speed while her eyes swept the horizons. Somewhere up there, death waited with the patience of circling vultures. The dive took her down to 15,000 feet before she leveled off, her airspeed indicator climbing past 400 knots. The desert floor rushed beneath her wings in a blur of brown and gold, but her attention remained locked on the sky above. They were up there, she was certain now. Multiple contacts, coordinated, professional. The kind of threat that turned training flights into memorial services. Her radio crackled with a new voice, younger, female, carrying a hint of doubt. "She's good. Better than the brief suggested." "Stay focused, Ghost," came the reply. "She's still just one pilot in an old airframe." Phantom smiled grimly inside her helmet. Old airframe, maybe, but flown by someone who'd earned her wings in combat, not in a simulator. The F-16 wasn't the newest fighter in the inventory, but in the right hands it could still bite. She began to climb again, spiraling upward while keeping her speed high. Time to even the odds. Captain Lisa Morrison watched the F-16 climb toward them with growing unease. The intelligence brief had painted Colonel Thorne as a competent but predictable pilot, someone who'd follow standard defensive doctrine, someone who could be easily outmaneuvered by superior technology. But the woman spiraling up from the desert floor moved like a predator who'd learned to hunt in 3 dimensions. "She's coming up fast," Morrison reported, her F-22 maintaining its invisible perch at 40,000 feet. Airspeed 450 and climbing. "Let her come," Kane's voice carried confidence that Morrison didn't feel. "When she reaches our altitude, we'll show her what real stealth can do." But something in Phantom's approach pattern troubled Morrison. The climbing spiral wasn't random. It was calculated, methodical, the kind of maneuver that suggested intimate knowledge of high-altitude tactics. Morrison had studied every combat report from Afghanistan, every engagement where coalition forces had faced sophisticated air defense networks. The patterns were eerily similar. "Raptor lead recommend we maintain separation," Morrison transmitted. "She's not climbing to fight, she's climbing to hunt." Kane's laugh came through the comm system with digital clarity. "Ghost, you're overthinking this. It's one F-16 against 4 F-22s. The mathematics are pretty simple." Morrison wasn't convinced. Mathematics didn't account for experience, for the kind of tactical awareness that came from surviving real combat. The woman below them had faced MiG-29s over Kandahar, had dodged surface-to-air missiles while providing close air support to troops in contact. She'd learned to fight against odds that would have broken lesser pilots. "She's at 25,000, Torres reported from his position on the eastern flank. "Still climbing, still accelerating." Morrison watched her tactical display as Phantom continued her ascent. The F-16's climb rate was impressive for an aircraft carrying a full load of air-to-air missiles, but more impressive was the precision of her flight path. She was following a search pattern, methodically clearing each altitude band before moving to the next. Hunting, not running. 30,000 feet, Morrison reported. She's leveling off." The F-16 had stopped climbing at exactly 30,000 feet, still 15,000 feet below the F-22's position, but close enough to be dangerous if she somehow detected them. Morrison's threat warning receiver remained silent, confirming that Phantom's radar wasn't painting them, but something felt wrong about the tactical situation. Then Phantom did something unexpected. She rolled inverted and began to dive, not toward the desert floor, but in a shallow descent that would take her directly underneath their formation. Morrison's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. "She knows we're here," Morrison whispered into her microphone. "She knows exactly where we are." Phantom's dive wasn't an escape maneuver, it was an attack run. The mathematics of aerial combat reduced to simple equations: energy, position, timing. Colonel Thorne had spent 2 decades learning to solve those equations under pressure, and right now, every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. Her hunters were above her, probably between 40 and 50,000 feet, maintaining what they thought was safe separation. They were wrong. She leveled off at 28,000 feet and began a shallow climb, her F-16's nose pointing toward empty sky while her mind worked through the tactical problem. 4 contacts, she was certain now. The radio chatter had revealed that much. Coordinated, professional flying aircraft sophisticated enough to defeat her radar. But stealth had limitations, and experience had taught her how to exploit them. The first limitation was human nature. Stealth pilots grew overconfident, believing technology made them invulnerable. They flew predictable patterns, maintained textbook formations, followed doctrine instead of instinct. Combat veterans knew better. They knew that in a real fight, doctrine was just a starting point. The second limitation was physics. Stealth aircraft weren't invisible, they were simply harder to detect. At the right angle, under the right conditions, even an F-22 would show up on radar for a few precious seconds. The trick was knowing where to look. Phantom rolled into a steep left turn, her nose swinging through the horizon as she began to search. Not with her radar, that would give away her position, but with her eyes and her experience. High-altitude contrails were rare in the desert air, but not impossible. Heat shimmer from jet exhausts could be spotted by someone who knew what to look for. Even the faint shadow of an aircraft against the blue sky could reveal its position to a trained observer. "Come on," she whispered, straining against her shoulder harness as she craned her neck to scan the sky above. "Show me where you are." The glint caught her eye at 2 o'clock high, not sunlight reflecting off metal but something more subtle. The briefest distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. She held her breath and watched, waiting for the shimmer to repeat itself. There, again, exactly where her tactical sense had told her to look. Her thumb moved to the master arm switch, then hesitated. Starting a fight at these odds was tantamount to suicide, but running wasn't an option either. They'd follow her, study her, dissect every move she made for their reports. Better to go down fighting than to give them an easy victory. Phantom to unknown contacts, she transmitted on guard frequency. I know you're up there. Let's do this like professionals. The radio silence stretched for several seconds before Kane's voice returned, carrying a note of grudging respect. Roger that, Phantom. Welcome to the future of air combat. Major Kane watched his tactical display with growing appreciation for their target's skill. Phantom had maneuvered herself into the classic underdog position, outnumbered, outgunned, but fighting on her terms instead of theirs. It was exactly the kind of tactical thinking the Pentagon wanted to test against their new stealth fighters. All Raptors maintain altitude and spacing, Kane transmitted. We're going to give the Colonel a demonstration she won't forget. But even as he spoke, Kane felt a flicker of doubt. Phantom's radio transmission had carried the confidence of someone who'd been here before, someone who'd faced impossible odds and somehow survived. The woman below them wasn't just a test pilot running through exercises. She was a combat veteran preparing for war. Raptor lead, she's turning toward us, Morrison reported. Her voice carried tension that Kane hadn't heard before. Aggressive climb, nose-on aspect. Kane checked his own sensors. The F-16 was indeed climbing toward them, but at an angle that would keep her below effective missile range for another 30 seconds. Plenty of time to demonstrate the F-22's superiority. He armed his AIM-120 AMRAAMs and selected Phantom's aircraft on his targeting system. Fox 3 simulation, Kane called, following the exercise protocols even though this had moved far beyond any planned demonstration. Splash 1 F-16. But Phantom didn't react like a pilot who'd just been killed in training. Instead, she rolled inverted and pulled into a split-S maneuver that took her diving toward the desert floor with startling speed. Kane watched his targeting solution dissolve as she disappeared into the radar clutter of the terrain below. Where'd she go? Torres asked, his confusion evident even through the digital comm system. Kane studied his display, but the F-16 had vanished into the electronic noise of the desert landscape. Phantom had just taught them something important about stealth warfare. It worked both ways. A skilled pilot could use terrain and tactics to become invisible even in an older aircraft. She's gone to ground, Kane reported. Reaper, take your flight down to medium altitude. Let's see if we can flush her out. But as the 4 F-22s began their descent, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer the hunters. Somewhere in the desert below, Colonel Thorne was waiting for them to make their first mistake. And in air combat, the first mistake was usually the last. The radio crackled with Phantom's voice, calm and professional. Gentlemen, the lesson is about to begin. 500 feet above the desert floor, Phantom's F-16 skimmed through the heat-shimmered air like a hawk hunting mice. The terrain-following radar painted the landscape in electronic detail, while she pushed her airspeed to the edge of safety, trading altitude for the invisibility that came with merging into the ground clutter. Above her, 4 of the world's most advanced fighters were learning their first lesson in tactical humility. The radio intercepts told her everything she needed to know. Raptor lead, call signs were always revealing. F-22s then, probably from the first fighter wing at Langley. Fresh from training, confident in their technology, about to discover that experience trumped electronics when the geometry got complicated. Her threat warning receiver painted intermittent contacts as the Raptors descended to hunt for her. their radars struggling to separate her F-16 from the electronic noise of rock and sand. She smiled inside her helmet, remembering similar hunts over Afghanistan, where Taliban fighters had learned to use terrain the same way. The hunter could become the hunted with nothing more than patience and tactical awareness. "There," she whispered, catching the brief radar signature of the lead Raptor as it dropped below 30,000 feet. The stealth coating was optimized for high-altitude interception, not low-level maneuvering. Down here in the weeds, physics started to even the odds. Phantom rolled into a climbing left turn, using a ridge line to mask her approach while she gained altitude and energy. The maneuver would bring her up behind the F-22 formation's southern flank, exactly where they wouldn't expect an attack from an aircraft that had just been diving toward the ground. "Raptor 2, I've got intermittent contact, bearing 270, came Morrison's voice over the radio. "Weak return, could be ground clutter." "Negative," Kane replied. "She's down there somewhere. Stay focused on the search pattern." Phantom crested the ridge at 12,000 feet, her F-16 emerging from the ground clutter like a submarine surfacing in hostile waters. Her radar immediately painted the nearest F-22, Morrison's aircraft, flying a predictable search pattern at 15,000 feet. The Raptor pilot was focused downward, hunting for a target that was suddenly above and behind her. "Gotcha," Phantom breathed, her thumb moving to the weapon select switch. She had perhaps 10 seconds before the F-22s detected her position, 10 seconds to prove that old airframes and experienced pilots could still teach new technology a few lessons about air combat. She locked onto Morrison's F-22 with her targeting radar, the missile tone steady in her headphones. "Fox 3, she called over guard frequency, following the simulation protocols. "Splash 1 Raptor." The radio exploded with surprised voices, as the 4 F-22 pilots realized their prey had just claimed one of their own. Captain Morrison stared at her threat warning display in disbelief. The F-16's targeting radar had achieved lock for a full 3 seconds, more than enough time for a real missile to turn her advanced fighter into burning wreckage scattered across the Nevada desert. In training exercises, that meant she was dead. "How the hell did she get behind me?" Morrison asked, banking hard to break the lock even though it was too late. "She used the terrain." Kane's voice carried a new note of respect. "Went low, stayed low, then popped up when we weren't looking in the right direction." Morrison watched her tactical display as Phantom's F-16 dove back toward the desert floor, disappearing once again into the radar clutter. The move demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that the intelligence briefs had completely missed. This wasn't just a competent pilot following doctrine. This was an artist working in 3 dimensions. "Raptor lead recommend we spread the formation," Morrison suggested. "She's picking us off one at a time because we're flying too close together." "Agreed. All flights extend separation to 20 miles. Make her work for the next shot." But as the F-22s spread across the desert sky, Morrison wondered if they were learning the right lessons. Phantom had just demonstrated that stealth technology wasn't invincible, that experience and tactical awareness could overcome technical superiority. More importantly, she'd shown them that the future of air combat would still depend on the human element, the pilot's ability to think, adapt, and fight beyond the limitations of their equipment. "Ghost, you're thinking too much," Torres called from his position on the eastern flank. "It's just one lucky shot." Morrison wasn't convinced. She'd watched the tactical replay of Phantom's attack, studied the precision of her approach and the timing of her emergence from the ground clutter. There had been nothing lucky about it. The woman flying that F-16 had executed a textbook low-altitude intercept against a superior opponent, using terrain and tactics to achieve what should have been impossible. "Lucky shots don't win wars," Morrison replied, "but pilots like her do." Below them, somewhere in the vast expanse of desert, Phantom was already positioning for her next attack. Morrison could feel it in the subtle changes in radio chatter, in the way the empty sky seemed to hold its breath. The hunt was far from over. And for the first time since climbing into her F-22 that morning, Morrison wasn't certain who was hunting whom. Colonel Thorne had always believed that air combat was chess played at 600 miles per hour. Each move revealed information about your opponent's capabilities, intentions, and limitations. Her first kill had taught her valuable lessons about the F-22s hunting her. They flew predictable search patterns, relied too heavily on their stealth technology, and their pilots were skilled but inexperienced in actual combat maneuvering. Now, climbing through 8,000 feet in a wide spiral that would bring her up behind their revised formation, she prepared to teach them lesson number 2, adaptive tactics. The Raptors had spread their formation to 20-mile intervals, making it impossible for her to engage multiple targets in a single attack run. Smart adjustment, but it created new vulnerabilities. With wider separation, they couldn't provide mutual support, couldn't coordinate their searches effectively. More importantly, it meant she could isolate and engage them one at a time without worrying about immediate retaliation from their wingmen. Her radar painted the westernmost F-22 call sign Reaper, based on the radio chatter, flying a methodical search pattern at 25,000 feet. The pilot was thorough but predictable, following a grid pattern that made his future position easy to calculate. Phantom adjusted her climb angle to intercept him at the optimal firing position. "Phantom to Reaper," she transmitted on a discrete frequency she'd been monitoring. "You're flying like you're looking for a lost aircraft instead of hunting an enemy. That's going to get you killed." Cross's voice came back immediately, betraying surprise that she'd isolated his radio frequency. "Phantom, you're outnumbered 4-1. Tactical advice seems premature." "Is it?" Phantom rolled inverted and pulled into a shallow dive that would bring her across Cross's flight path at a 90-degree angle. "Check your 6." Cross's F-22 immediately began defensive maneuvering, but Phantom had timed her approach perfectly. Her radar achieved lock just as the Raptor pilot began his turn, catching him in the vulnerable moment when his stealth profile was no longer optimized against her targeting angle. "Fox 3, she called, "Splash 2. The radio fell silent for several seconds before Kane's voice returned, carrying frustrated admiration. "Phantom, how are you doing this?" "Experience, Raptor lead. 23 years of flying, 8 years of combat, and the knowledge that technology is only as good as the human using it." She rolled wings level and began another climb, already positioning for the next engagement. "Your pilots are skilled, but they're thinking like engineers instead of warriors." Kane's F-22 appeared on her radar scope, approaching from the northwest at high speed. The lead Raptor pilot had abandoned his search pattern and was coming for her directly, exactly the kind of emotional decision that separated simulation from reality. "2 down, 2 to go," Phantom whispered, her fingers dancing across the weapon controls as she prepared for the most dangerous engagement yet. Kane was clearly the most experienced of the F-22 pilots, and now he was flying angry. That made him both more dangerous and more predictable. The sky around them had become a three-dimensional chessboard, where one wrong move meant death. Major Kane pushed his F-22 through a climbing turn that stressed the airframe to its design limits, his eyes locked on the radar return that represented Colonel Thorne's F-16. 2 of his pilots were dead, killed by an opponent they'd underestimated, and now the demonstration had become something more personal. This wasn't about testing technology anymore. It was about proving which pilot understood air combat better. "Raptor lead has contact," Kane reported, his targeting radar painting Phantom's aircraft as she climbed through 15,000 feet. "Bearing 045, 20 miles and closing." "Copy lead," Torres responded from his position to the south, moving to support. But Kane waved off his wingman with a sharp radio call. "Negative, Shadow. This is between me and her." It was a mistake born of pride, and Kane realized it even as the words left his mouth. Air combat was about teamwork, mutual support, overwhelming the enemy with coordinated attacks. But something about Phantom's performance had gotten under his skin, challenged his assumptions about the superiority of his aircraft and his training. "You want to dance, Colonel," Kane transmitted on guard frequency. "Let's see what you can do against someone who's not following the textbook." Phantom's response came immediately, her voice carrying quiet confidence. "Major, I wrote parts of that textbook, but if you want to go one-on-one, I'm happy to oblige." Kane armed his AIM-120 missiles and began a dive that would take him down to Phantom's altitude. The F-22's superior thrust-to-weight ratio gave him the advantage in a vertical fight, but Phantom had already demonstrated her ability to use terrain and tactics to overcome technical superiority. This engagement would test his skills as much as his aircraft's capabilities. "Merging," Kane called as the distance between them dropped below 10 miles. Both aircraft were supersonic now, closing at a combined speed that would bring them together in less than 30 seconds. Phantom's F-16 suddenly rolled inverted and pulled into a split-S maneuver that took her diving toward the desert floor. For a moment, Kane thought she was running from the fight, but then he realized what she was doing. The maneuver would bring her around behind him if he continued his current flight path, setting up a perfect rear-quarter attack. Kane rolled his F-22 into a vertical climb, using his superior thrust to gain altitude while avoiding Phantom's tactical trap. But as he pulled through the top of his loop, he caught sight of the F-16 leveling off at low altitude, already turning to position for another attack. "She's good," Kane admitted to himself, beginning a spiraling descent that would keep his nose pointed toward Phantom while maintaining energy for maneuvering. "Damn good." The radio crackled with Phantom's transmission. "Your move, Major." Torres watched the engagement develop from his position 15 miles to the south, every instinct telling him to intervene. Kane was skilled, but he was flying emotionally now, making decisions based on pride rather than tactics. The F-16 pilot had already demonstrated her ability to exploit such mistakes. "Raptor lead recommend I move to support," Torres transmitted, but Kane's response was immediate and sharp. "Negative shadow, maintain position and observe." Torres bit back his reply, watching as Kane's F-22 and Phantom's F-16 began a deadly spiral dance in the desert sky. Both aircraft were pulling high-G turns, their contrails scribing geometric patterns against the blue as each pilot sought the decisive advantage. On his tactical display, Torres could see the engagement developing like a textbook example of single combat. Kane held the altitude advantage and superior thrust, but Phantom had positioning and experience. More critically, she was fighting on her terms, drawing Kane into the kind of close-range maneuvering where pilot skill mattered more than advanced avionics. "She's baiting him," Torres realized, speaking to his empty cockpit, drawing him into a knife fight. The F-16 rolled out of a climbing turn and dove toward the deck, Kane's Raptor following closely. But instead of continuing her dive, Phantom suddenly pulled into a brutal 9G turn that brought her nose around toward Kane's aircraft. The move would have been impossible in a heavier fighter, but the F-16's superior turn rate allowed her to reverse position faster than Kane could react. Torres watched in fascination as Phantom achieved a brief firing solution on Kane's F-22, her targeting radar painting the Raptor for 2 precious seconds before Kane's superior thrust allowed him to break away. It should have been another kill, but Phantom held her fire. "Warning shot," Torres breathed, understanding the message she was sending. She could have killed Kane but chose not to, demonstrating that mercy was sometimes more devastating than destruction. Kane's voice came over the radio, tight with concentration and newfound respect. "Message received, Phantom." But the engagement wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The vertical fight that followed would have made Chuck Yeager proud. Kane's F-22 and Phantom's F-16 climbed toward the stratosphere in a spiraling dance of thrust and gravity, each pilot pushing their aircraft to its absolute limits while seeking the split-second advantage that would determine victory. At 30,000 feet, Kane held the energy advantage. His F-22's superior thrust-to-weight ratio allowed him to maintain airspeed in the climb, while Phantom's F-16 began to slow. But altitude was only one dimension of the battle, and Phantom had already demonstrated her ability to turn disadvantage into opportunity. "She's running out of energy," Kane reported to Tors, his voice tight with G-force strain. "This is where physics wins." But even as he spoke, Phantom did something unexpected. Instead of continuing the climb or rolling into a dive, she pulled her F-16 into a hammerhead stall, a maneuver that traded all her forward airspeed for position. The move brought her nose around to point directly at Kane's climbing F-22, and for one heart-stopping moment, both aircraft hung motionless in the thin air like gunfighters at high noon. Kane's training took over. He rolled inverted and pulled into a split-S, using gravity to regain airspeed while diving away from Phantom's guns. But the F-16 pilot had anticipated his response. She allowed her aircraft to fall into a controlled stall, then used the F-16's superior roll rate to point her nose down toward Kane's diving Raptor. "Fox 2," Phantom called, simulating a heat-seeking missile shot. Splash 3. Kane felt the weight of defeat settle on his shoulders as he pulled out of his dive at 15,000 feet. Phantom had used his own superior performance against him, turning the vertical fight into a trap that left him vulnerable to her simulated missile shot. It was a masterpiece of tactical flying, the kind of maneuver that would be studied in classrooms for years to come. "Confirmed kill," Kane admitted over the radio. "Phantom, that was." He paused, searching for words adequate to describe what he just witnessed. "That was beautiful flying." Phantom's F-16 rolled wings level above him, her voice carrying quiet satisfaction. "Thank you, Major. Your aircraft is impressive, but you flew it like you were afraid to get it dirty." Tors found himself alone in the sky with a pilot who had just systematically dismantled his entire flight. 3 F-22s, destroyed by one F-16 flown, by a woman who understood that air combat was as much about psychology as physics. He activated his radio with something approaching reverence. "Phantom, this is Shadow. I'd like to request a different kind of engagement." "Oh." "Yes, ma'am, I'd like to learn." The radio silence that followed Tor's transmission stretched across the Nevada desert like a held breath. Phantom's F-16 held station at 25,000 feet, her aircraft silhouetted against the blue sky like a predator deciding whether to strike or spare its prey. Tors waited, his hands steady on the F-22's controls while his mind processed the tactical lessons he'd just witnessed. "What did you have in mind, Shadow?" Phantom's voice carried curiosity rather than the edge of combat. "Your friends thought they could teach me about the future of air warfare. Turns out they needed to learn about the fundamentals." Tors checked his fuel state, enough for another 30 minutes of maneuvering, then began a shallow climb toward Phantom's position. "I'd like to understand how you defeated stealth technology. Not just the tactics, but the thinking behind them." "Stealth isn't magic, Captain," Phantom replied, her F-16 rolling into a gentle left turn that brought both aircraft into a lazy circle at altitude. "It's engineering, and engineers make assumptions about how their technology will be used. Sometimes those assumptions are wrong." As Tors moved his F-22 into formation with Phantom's F-16, he could see her clearly for the first time. Helmet, shoulders, the subtle movements of her hands on the controls. There was something almost ceremonial about flying formation with a pilot who had just redefined his understanding of air combat. "The first assumption," Phantom continued, "is that stealth makes you invisible. It doesn't. It makes you harder to detect, but detection isn't just about radar. It's about understanding your environment, recognizing when something doesn't belong, trusting your instincts when technology fails you. Torres absorbed this while maintaining perfect formation discipline. The F-16 beside him looked antiquated compared to his F-22, but he was beginning to understand that appearance could be deceiving. In the right hands, an older aircraft could be more dangerous than the most advanced fighter in the inventory. The second assumption, Phantom said, is that superior technology equals superior tactics. Your flight demonstrated perfect textbook procedures, search patterns, formation discipline, communication protocols. But you were so focused on following doctrine that you forgot to think. Think about what? About your opponent. You treated me like a problem to be solved rather than a pilot to be defeated. You analyzed my aircraft specifications instead of studying my behavior. That's why you flew predictable patterns, why you maintained formations that made tactical sense on paper but ignored the human element of combat. Torres felt the weight of truth in her words. The briefings had focused on the F-16's technical limitations, its lack